It includes details on what Betsy Hackman was searching for before she died and the first-person view of the officers as they found the couple dead at home.
Everyone spent weeks whispering about FBI raids and those secret tunnels allegedly hidden under Gene Hackman's Santa Fe estate. But the reality that surfaced in early 2025 felt infinitely more tragic. When local officers finally breached that desert fortress, they didn't find some high-tech bunker. Instead, they stepped into a suffocating, mummified silence that transformed an Oscar winner's retirement paradise into a grim, self-made tomb. The details were honestly hard to stomach. Let's dive in. Hollywood's fortress builder. The moment Gene Hackman walked away from Hollywood in 2004, he didn't just leave the industry, he essentially tried to delete himself from the public eye altogether. It was wild because he was still one of the most respected actors on the planet, but after he filmed his final movie, he decided that he was finished with the fame, the red carpets, and the cameras. He chose Santa Fe, New Mexico, as his sanctuary, where he and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, settled into a life that they intended to be completely untouchable. They bought a massive estate for $4 million, and Hackman, who always had a bit of a knack for architecture and design, spent years turning it into what people called a Pueblo colonial masterpiece. Now, here's where it got interesting. He didn't just want a nice home, he wanted a fortress. According to Kevin Thompson, a real estate contributor at the New York Times, the property was often compared to an Armani suit because of its sleek, timeless design. But beneath that beauty, it was incredibly fortified. He renovated the property with an almost obsessive focus on security and seclusion. We were talking about high stone walls, state-of-the-art AI-integrated cameras that monitored every single inch of the perimeter, and a layout that made it nearly impossible for anyone to see inside from the road. He even built a private theater and a gym, so he literally never had to leave the grounds if he didn't want to. It was the ultimate dream for a man who spent his life being stared at. But as he got older, that dream started to look a lot more like a cage. He spent over 20 years tucked away behind those walls, rarely seen by the locals in Santa Fe unless he was driving his old truck around town for a quick errand. But mostly, he stayed within that secure bubble he worked so hard to build. According to reporting from USA Today, the home was designed to be the ultimate statement of privacy, yet that very design became a double-edged sword. It was beautiful, sure, but it was also incredibly isolated from the rest of the world, and that was the uncomfortable truth of the situation. He built that place to keep the world out so he could grow old in peace with Betsy, but he didn't realize that by making himself unreachable, he was also making it impossible for the world to reach him if something went wrong. Think about that for a second. When did the walls he built to protect himself actually start to imprison him completely? It was a fine line between privacy and total isolation, and for Gene, that line entirely disappeared as the years went on. He thought he created the perfect haven where he was able to spend his final days in total control, but those same walls stood silent and immovable when help was needed most in February 2025. Silent alarms. February 26, 2025, started as just another Tuesday for a local maintenance worker who arrived at the Hackman estate for a routine check on the property. He stood at the massive entrance, pressed the buzzer, and waited. But for the first time in years, there was absolutely no response from inside. Now, here was the thing that made his stomach churn. The high-tech security system was fully active. The cameras were blinking, and everything looked perfectly normal from the outside. But that silence felt heavy and wrong. He eventually realized that something was seriously off and called the Santa Fe Sheriff's Office, which led to what was supposed to be a simple, routine welfare check. When the officers arrived, they didn't see any signs of a struggle or a forced entry, which actually made the situation feel even more ominous. They moved through the property, eventually making their way into the living quarters, and that was when the high-tech dream of the Armani house turned into a literal nightmare. According to the footage and details later released by Global News, the scene inside was completely frozen in time. They found the mummified remains of 95-year-old Gene Hackman, and his 65-year-old wife, Betsy Arakawa, along with their dog. It wasn't just a recent tragedy. The state of the bodies suggested that they had been there for quite some time, entirely unnoticed by the world they worked so hard to shut out. It was a devastating sight because you had this legend who was surrounded by the best technology money could buy. Yet none of those silent alarms actually triggered a call for help when the couple was actually in distress. Because the house was so secluded and the neighbors were so far away, nobody heard a thing, and nobody saw the mail piling up or the lack of movement. Have you ever ignored a silence that felt like it was actually screaming for your attention? For the people in Gene's life, that silence was just part of his brand of extreme privacy, so nobody thought to question it until it was far too late. The investigators stood in that quiet house and realized that the very seclusion Hackman craved acted as a shroud that hid his final moments from the world. There were no secret tunnels or FBI hits, as the internet rumors suggested later on. Just a very old man and his wife who slipped away in a fortress that functioned exactly as it was designed to. It kept everyone out. But as the police began to document the scene, that very silence bred suspicion fast for the investigators because they needed to know exactly what could have killed two people and their pet at the same time without a single person noticing. Suspicious shadows. The moment those first reports hit the wire, the atmosphere in Santa Fe shifted from quiet tragedy to a full-blown criminal mystery. Here was the thing that really messed with everyone's head. The investigators couldn't immediately say how Gene and Betsy died because the decomposition was so advanced. We were talking about a timeline of weeks, maybe even a month, where two high-profile people just vanished from existence inside their own home without a single alarm going off. Adan Mendoza, the Santa Fe County Sheriff, according to a report by CBS News, didn't hold back when he initially labeled the scene as suspicious. He wasn't necessarily saying there was a murderer on the loose, but when you found two bodies and a pet in that state of decay within a multi-million-dollar fortress, you didn't just walk away and call it natural causes. A massive probe launched almost immediately, and the estate that Hackman built for peace was suddenly crawling with forensic teams and investigators in white suits. They were looking for any sign of a struggle, a forced entry, or even a carbon monoxide leak. But the house was as tight as a drum. This was the exact window of time where the internet absolutely lost its mind. Because the police were being so careful and the word disturbing was being thrown around in the local circles, the myths about secret FBI tunnels and underground bunkers started to grow legs. People couldn't wrap their brains around the idea that a Hollywood titan could just expire in his living room and stay there for weeks. But wait, it actually got deeper than that. While the world was dreaming up spy movies, the actual detectives were stuck in the grueling, slow process of toxicology and autopsy rushes. They had to treat that beautiful Pueblo masterpiece like a potential crime scene, because in their world, time plus silence almost always equaled something foul. It was easy to look at those high walls and imagine a dark conspiracy, but the detectives were looking for something much more microscopic. The investigation felt like it was moving in slow motion, while the public's curiosity was at a fever pitch. Every day that passed without a clear cause of death only fueled the idea that something disturbing happened beneath the floorboards of that mansion. But as the medical examiner finally got to work, the shadows started to pull back, and the autopsies began to cut through the dark with a brutal, clinical clarity that nobody saw coming. Rodent, plague. March 7th, 2025, was the day the wild internet conspiracies finally hit a brick wall of cold, hard science. For weeks, people talked about secret underground tunnels and high-stakes foul play, but the official report from the medical examiner told a story that was actually much more terrifying because it was so ordinary. According to a report by Today Health, the disturbing element found at the scene wasn't a secret room or a crime, but a rare and deadly microscopic invader called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. It turned out that Betsy Arakawa likely contracted this virus around February 17th. probably from coming into contact with rodent droppings in a hidden corner of that massive estate. In the high desert of New Mexico, this is a real and present danger. But you'd never expect it to breach a $4 million fortress. The virus was aggressive, and it took her life quickly, leaving Gene Hackman entirely alone in that silent house. Now, here was the part that truly broke everyone's heart once the full investigation update was released by CNN on March 7th. Gene didn't have the virus, but at 95 years old, he was already battling advanced heart disease and the early stages of Alzheimer's. The tox screens came back completely negative for any poisons or foul play, which proved that this wasn't a hit or a heist. It was a collapse of a household. Because of his cognitive state, Gene likely didn't even fully grasp what was happening when Betsy passed away. He had a pacemaker, but that little piece of technology couldn't save him from the grief or the physical toll of being left without his primary caregiver. He lingered for about 24 hours after her, essentially waiting in the silence of that secure mansion until his heart finally gave out around February 18th. Think about that for a second. He was one of the most famous men on Earth, living in a house equipped with AI cameras and top-tier security. Yet he was effectively trapped by his own health and the isolation he spent decades perfecting. It makes you wonder about the world we live in today. What invisible home threat actually scares you most these days? We worry so much about intruders or digital hackers, but for the Hackmans, the threat was a tiny virus and the simple reality of growing old in total seclusion. The irony was absolutely staggering. Gene spent a fortune building walls to keep the world away so he could protect his family, but nature found a way to sneak a tunnel of death right past his security guards and AI sensors. It was a silent biological breach that proved nature's sneak is often deadlier than any Hollywood plot he ever acted in. Yet, even as the medical truth came out, people still couldn't stop looking at those high walls and wondering why they didn't do their job. All that fortress technology promised total safety, but in the end, it was a big lie that ensured no one could hear the silence until it was too late. Security paradox. It was a truly strange reality because the very technology Gene Hackman installed to guarantee his safety ended up being the thing that ensured his death stayed a secret for weeks. Think about the sheer amount of processing power running through that house with the high-end cameras and the integrated security systems that monitored every single movement on the perimeter. All of that hardware was designed to keep the world out, and it performed that job with terrifying efficiency. While Gene and Betsy lay inside that pristine Santa Fe mansion, those cameras kept right on recording empty hallways and quiet courtyards, never once sensing that the lack of human movement was actually an emergency. The security paradox was absolutely undeniable in this case because his obsession with reclusive privacy backfired in the most tragic way possible. He built a masterpiece of isolation where the walls were so thick and the property was so secluded that the natural decay of two human beings didn't even register with the outside world. For the Hackmans, their smart home was a silent witness that didn't have the intelligence to call for help when the routine of the household completely stopped. By the time the estate finally went back on the market, the world seemed eager to wash away the grim details of what happened behind those walls. According to a report from the New York Times on January 30th, 2026, the famous Armani house sold for a staggering $6.25 million. The new owners walked into a property that looked entirely pristine, with all those high-tech features still intact and ready to protect the next person who wanted to vanish from society. It was as if the house itself had a short memory, even though the story of what happened there was already becoming a permanent part of Hollywood lore. But even with the medical examiner's report and the real estate closing, people still couldn't accept the simple, quiet tragedy of it all. The vacuum left by that weeks-long silence was just too large, and it didn't take long for the public imagination to start filling it with something more cinematic. Because the reality was so lonely and so human, a viral fantasy about an FBI discovery and a secret tunnel began to fill the void, turning a story of tragic isolation into a conspiracy that refused to stay buried. Tunnel hoax exposed. Here is the thing about a tragedy involving a legend like Gene Hackman. When the truth is quiet and heartbreaking, people will literally invent a louder, crazier lie just to fill the silence. Within days of the discovery in Santa Fe, the internet was absolutely crawling with claims that the FBI had swooped in to uncover a massive secret tunnel system hidden beneath the mansion. According to a viral video by the channel The News Loop, some people were even claiming that investigators found a 312-foot passage filled with Nazi gold and classified government documents. It sounded like something straight out of an action movie Hackman would have starred in back in the 70s, but it was entirely fabricated. The reality was that the FBI was never even the lead agency on this case, as it was handled by the local Santa Fe Sheriff's Office from start to finish. There was no mention of a tunnel in the official police reports, and there was certainly no hidden bunker listed when the estate was sold for over $6 million in 2026. It was pure clickbait that took advantage of the suspicious vibe created by the decomposition timeline. Because the public couldn't wrap their heads around a Hollywood titan being taken down by a simple rodent virus, they chose to believe in shadows instead. Think about that for a second. It is so much easier to believe in a grand conspiracy than it is to accept that a 95-year-old man died alone in a house that was too secure for its own good. This myth was born entirely out of the gap between the tragedy and the truth, proving that hype will always try to fill a void when the facts take too long to arrive. But as the dust settled, the real disturbing find wasn't a tunnel at all. It was the legacy of a man who escaped the world so well that the world couldn't find him when it mattered. Hackman's End warns us about something far deeper than any internet hoax. Recluses' warning. The journey of Gene Hackman really was a fascinating, albeit tragic arc that went from the peak of Hollywood fame to the silence of a desert tomb. When he quit the industry in 2004, he was looking for a paradise where the cameras couldn't follow him, and for 20 years he actually found it. But as we look at the final police files mentioned in the BBC News report on the isolation of aging stars, it becomes clear that his off-grid dream eventually turned into a deadly reality. He built a fortress to keep the world away, but that very same security ensured that his final moments were spent in a vacuum. There is a real lesson here about the balance between solitude and safety that we all have to navigate eventually. It turns out that the true, disturbing discovery wasn't anything physical buried in the dirt, but the realization that his paradise had slowly transformed into a prison of his own making. Those walls were built to protect him, but they also acted as a barrier that kept help at bay when a simple welfare check could have changed everything. It was a high-tech isolation paradox that showed how an off-grid dream is incredibly dangerous without a human system of checks and balances. Every legend has an ending, and Hackman's was as quiet as his career was loud. He proved that you can build the highest walls in the world, but nature and time will always find a way in. The real question left behind isn't about what was under the house, but whether those walls were actually worth the final silence they created. How far would you honestly go to escape the world if you knew the world might not be able to find you when you needed it most? After hearing this story, does the idea of total privacy still feel like a dream, or does it start to look like a risk you aren't willing to take? Until next time, ciao.